Hello, everyone. My name is Brooks Rainwater, and I'm the Senior Executive and Director of the Center for City Solutions at the National League of Cities. I'm excited for our conversation today with Richard Florida and David Adams about the writing on the Heartland, the growth of innovation districts, and the changing nature of the workforce. Over the past few years, the pandemic has accelerated trends towards hybrid and remote work and has greatly impacted our cities big and small. And of course, as we've seen the great resignation take hold across industries, we have seen huge changes in where and how people work. The Silicon Heartland, an insightful moniker for the innovation and economic growth taking place beyond the so-called superstar hubs like Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, or Austin, shows that our growth doesn't have to be purely bicoastal. Middle America is poised for an economic revitalization and the entire nation will benefit. As an advocate for strong local leadership and building vibrant and successful cities, I'm particularly happy to moderate this conversation between two like-minded leaders who have researched the evolving urban landscape and workforce and led the charge in implementing purpose-driven strategies that are making real-world impact on the heartland and beyond. Richard Florida is one of the world's leading urbanists, a professor at the University of Toronto, and co-founder of CityLab. He is the author of The Rise of the Creative Class and the New Urban Crisis, and a new report, Heartland of Talent, released by Heartland Forward. David Adams is the executive director of the Cincinnati Innovation District and chief innovation officer at the University of Cincinnati, where he oversees the university's innovation agenda and is the architect of the Cincinnati Innovation District. His focus is simple: to ensure the world knows that Cincinnati can provide a model for innovation districts with the goal of empowering transformation for all. So with the introductions out of the way, let's dig into our conversation today. You both recently co-authored an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal titled "Goodbye to the Days of the Rust Belt" about the revitalization of the heartland. How has this resurgence come about and why now? Richard, we'll start with you.
Hey, Brooks. Hey, David. It's great to be with both of you today. I spent most of my adult career in the heartland, broadly defined. After growing up in New Jersey and Newark, in the suburbs of Newark, I moved to Columbus, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I got a 3-year sabbatical in Washington, D.C., and then moved to Toronto, which, if it was an American city, would qualify as the heartland because it's a part of the Great Lakes. And one day during the pandemic, I know this sounds ridiculous and David will have a much better answer. I was looking, because I have little kids, I was getting tired of looking at expensive housing and looking at expensive private schools where kids can't get admitted because there's too many people vying for entry. So I just went to realtor.com. And I started looking at housing prices in the Detroit suburbs, in the Cleveland suburbs, in the Cincinnati suburbs, in the Pittsburgh suburbs. And I found something just quite amazing and apocryphal. All those places were still affordable. At the same time, it wasn't just New York or San Francisco, or it was Austin and Miami and Denver, and go on. All these rise of the rest cities in the Sun Belt were becoming more unaffordable. And then I started talking to people and they're, my kids are in great public schools and my kids are in private schools. There's no problem getting kids in. And I thought to myself, while the COVID pandemic has caused this shift to the Sun Belt, as people wanted outdoor space and they wanted warm climates and they wanted, maybe some people wanted less COVID restrictions, depending on how you are. There was this other thing that remote work could do. And for families with small kids who wanted an affordable place to live with great schools and great quality of life and really good urban amenities, in those downtowns, why not the heartland? And then David figured out all like the hard economic development stuff, but that's how I came to it.
How about you, Richard? David? Well, I'm going to build on that. So Brooks, first, thanks for hosting this today. Richard, it's great to see you as always. And I come from this from a little bit different perspective. I'm a former software executive that just happened to live here in the Midwest. I lived in Indianapolis for many, many years. But as I was leaving the software industry, the quote unquote interesting opportunities kept arising in places like Silicon Valley, Boston, and other locations. And I always questioned, why can't those things happen here in the Midwest? What's really some of the challenges that we're facing? And, we've had a fundamental shift from the so-called agricultural society to the industrial society. We're now in the knowledge economy, or as Richard would call it, the creative class, where we know that people are really driving, the economy of today. And it's been interesting as I've talked to businesses, the big question they continue to ask is, do you have the talent? Do you have the people necessary to support this? Because it's highly visible, in these coastal locations. And as Richard pointed out, I mean, we've got great affordability here, but being able to address that question has been what's been on the minds, continues to be on the minds of the companies that we talk to, and candidly, not just the ones we're talking to, but the ones that any company you talk to throughout the world is trying to address. And I think we're doing those things here today, but it's also why I think the opportunity of the resurgence here in the Heartland, is upon us.
So, Brooks, let me just comment on that. So, coming full circle, David being based in Cincinnati, my having started my career in Columbus, I think we were both struck with the Intel announcement. And we were actually talking about writing a piece like this, and the Intel announcement happened, and we began to talk a lot about what that meant. And in addition to affordability and great quality of life and a great, surge of amenities over the past 20 years, there are great universities. Ohio State, Michigan, Indiana, we can go down the list, Purdue. There's these great universities. They're big. There's this great workforce. And what's important, and I learned this at Carnegie Mellon, there's a workforce that not only knows how to use its head, but how to use its hands. This young kid who ran the engineering lab at Carnegie Mellon always said this: if you want to hire engineers who know how to actually make things, not just create software, go to Purdue, go to Ohio State, go to Michigan State. The kids coming from factory towns and rural communities know how to build stuff. So the other part of this was this idea that because of supply chains, because of global conflict, because of China and Russia, world affairs, folks were looking to onshore stuff. And the Midwest, or the Heartland, was a good place to do it. And the other thing is that there's just a lot of sites. It's rudimentary, but there are a lot of these big sites that are more hard to assemble a big site in Southern or Northern California now. Maybe it was easy to do 50 years ago. That are affordable, that are well served by transport. So for all those reasons, there's a lot of work to do, but I think it's the first time in the past half century or more. People argue that the places like Pittsburgh and Detroit have been declining since before, since the 1930s or 40s or 50s. It's the first time in my adult life that you can really see a pathway to dramatic economic potential recovery for the Heartland.
Yeah, Rich, and if I may just build on that, the thing that to me is so really interesting about Intel is, they could have gone a lot of locations. And we think about some of the challenges that, kind of just get discussed in the Heartland from time to time about, talent leaving the Heartland and moving to the coast in some form or fashion, or the cities that we all know. You look at this on the surface and you say, why the Midwest? Why the Heartland? And I think Richard rightly points out, there's lots of available space here where companies like this can go, but this will be the most advanced manufacturing facility probably anywhere in the world. And so when we talk about this workforce discussion, it'd be real easy to look at the Heartland and say, the workforce isn't there necessary to support Intel. Why not go to, a place like Austin or Silicon Valley where, the workforce may or may not be there to be able to support that. What's really interesting about this is that Intel saw a state here in Ohio with the work that we've been doing with our innovation districts, with the work the governor, lieutenant governor have been doing to help build the workforce of the future. But Intel sees this as a place where they can actually get access and develop the workforce that's going to be needed for their business. And I think that's a really fundamental shift in the economic discussion. It's not necessarily, are they there today to support my workforce, but are there communities, are there states that are willing to build the workforce that's needed? And I think in a very real way, Pat Gelsinger, their CEO, saw Ohio as a place where that workforce could be developed. And they're putting their money where their mouth is. They're committing initially $50 million to colleges and universities, everything from community colleges to Carnegie level ones like us in Ohio State, to really help build that workforce. And we find that very exciting because we believe too, as Richard and I have talked about, we believe this can be a model for the Heartland and for others and for other communities looking to do this as a means to help build the workforce that may not be there today, but as a means to actually develop it for the organizations that need it.
So sticking with this on Intel, I'm curious, talent attraction and retention is clearly a key topic. You have the universities there in the Midwest, you have the talent. But do you see talent leaving the biggest challenge driving economic growth in mid-sized and smaller cities throughout Middle America, or is there something else?
Well, I think it's a great question. And 20 years ago, when I started to raise this issue that talent might be a factor in economic development, people thought it was bazonkers. Like they literally, the mayor of Pittsburgh at the time, Tom Murphy, just said, "Richard, we thought you were crazy." Like he's my friend. He's like, "We just thought you were crazy. Like this made no sense to us." And now it's sort of the bread and butter of economic development. I think there's a couple dimensions to this. One, I think, as David said, the Midwest, the Heartland, the Ohios, the Michigans, the Indianas, the Wisconsins, the Minnesotas, and their southern brethren, the Tennessees and the Kentuckys, even bleeding down to Arkansas. They're affordable. They're still affordable. They're some of the few places in America that remain affordable for regular working families. So that's important. If you want to retain and attract talent, if a place is, and Austin's not anymore. There was a time when Austin was affordable, but it's not affordable anymore. And the Midwest communities, Heartland communities are. The second thing is they have big public universities and big community college systems, which produce great talent pipelines. Often that talent was, as you implied, was exported. But I think now, I think there's the demographic divide. Look, I think still going to struggle. Most Midwest communities. I think Columbus is different. I lived in Columbus. It's a college town. I think college towns, I think Indianapolis is different. They're post-industrial towns. But I think many of the Midwest communities outside of maybe Chicago are still going to have a little struggle attracting the best and brightest kids out of university. They want to go to the big city. They want to go to Chicago or Minneapolis, or in many cases, New York. So that's fine. But what happens is as soon as those youngsters get married and have a family, because of the rise of remote work, they get to choose through a much bigger portfolio of places. Before they'd have to go to a New York suburb or a San Francisco suburb or whatever, Chicago suburb. Now you can go anywhere. And I think what's going to happen, I really believe this, it's happening now, but I think it's going to happen more, is that more and more of those young families are going to they're going to first take a stab and say, why don't I think about Austin or Nashville or Miami? They're going to go on a visit. They're going to look at, there's no houses available, and the houses that are available cost 7 figures. And they're quickly going to go, life ain't so bad in the Midwest, where I can get a beautiful house for far less for that, and I can have great amenities and lifestyle for my family. So I think what's going to happen is that many of the, and I think there's a reason for this. I think, and I hate making these broad comparisons, but bear with me, and I'm qualifying it. Many of these Sunbelt cities are younger. They don't have the developed public goods. They have some great schools, but not as many. They don't have as many great parks. They don't have as many museums, culture, theater. They don't have these historic private schools that are kind of named and storied in America. And I think that the Midwest towns that were built, on robber baron wealth, if you will, they've got a lot of stuff that people want and need. And for a long time, they didn't have great jobs. People wanted to move to what's new. But I think what you're likely to see is that for families, that these older Midwestern or Heartland cities have a lot to offer. And that's going to be where they can really up their game in attracting and retaining talent.
If you think about these small to mid-sized cities, one of the other key characteristics that, I'd like to build upon Richard's comments is the agility, the ability to move quickly. That, a Silicon Valley, a Boston and Austin, just because of the nature of the ecosystem, it's not easy to make that happen. But it does all come down to talent. And I think the communities that can figure out how to connect the economic engines that produce this talent, so whether it's a community college or a Carnegie Level 1 research institutions, the ability to really connect those engines to the businesses and help meet their needs are going to be the ones that actually are successful over time. And candidly, if you go back, 10, 20 years ago, this conversation about, connecting university engines to businesses really wasn't a big deal. In other words, we produce college grads, kind of hope it works out well for you, and companies recruited in a very traditional way through career fairs and other sundry. But now that we're squarely in this economy, being able to link very tightly a corporate need with university degrees and help individuals see the opportunity at these companies becomes really important. There's also a really interesting demographic piece that's happening as well. We know there's a lot of data to support people are changing jobs more frequently, but they're not moving as often. So to build on Richard's comments about people wanting to come back, one of the things they've got to see is that there are a lot of interesting opportunities in the communities in which they might want to live. mean, in today's environment, what makes, an Austin or Seattle or Denver attractive is it's very easy for that talent to see that there's lots of interesting opportunities. Our innovation districts here in a very real way provide an opportunity for individuals to see that, hey, there's a lot happening here in Cincinnati, or a lot happening in Columbus or Cleveland or wherever those locations might be. You can see it all in one place. And that's really important when you're thinking about individuals. In today's creative class economy, people are looking for highly interesting opportunities. And unlike my generation that thought about maybe 1 to 3 jobs over a 30-year career, it's not unheard of for that generation today to think about 12 to 20 jobs over a 30-year career. So when I'm picking a community, I'm picking community not only for the job I'm taking, but I really want to see all the availability of opportunities that would be open to me to stay in that city. And clearly I have to have the amenities and everything else. And I agree wholeheartedly with Richard. I mean, I think there are going to be cities that are going to really prosper during this, and there are going to be cities that struggle. But part of the challenge I think collectively everyone's facing is also the pace of change. And I think cities have to have models that they can look at, not that everything is replicable to say this is the model, kind of like building a home. There is an architecture, a framework to how communities can make this happen. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned here in Cincinnati is we've become a model for Columbus and Cleveland. We believe this model can also be a model for other communities as well, to help them accelerate their growth.
I'm curious how you see the geography of innovation changing. We talk about the clustering of superstar cities and the rise of the rest. I know you have some recent research on this subject, so maybe you could dig in a little bit here.
So I think we should separate out the geography of innovation from the geography of talent. And, I love Steve Case. He's a great guy. We communicate often on Twitter, and his heart is in the rise of the rest. I mean, he really has been advocating for 20 years from his heart and soul about the rise of the rest. But when you look at the data on innovation, when you look at the data, there's new data just out from Harvard on patents. Brookings has looked at data on technology industry clustering. We've looked at the data on venture capital backing of high-tech commercial startups, which we believe is the best indicator of technological innovation. Who's going to bet big on industry disrupting commercially relevant companies and technologies? It's a very few places in America. It's a handful. It's the Bay Area, not just the Silicon Valley, but even more so San Francisco. And San Francisco has not lost share. People keep saying it's declining, but the data don't suggest that. The Silicon Valley has lost share to San Francisco, but San Francisco has not lost share. The big place that has risen in the rankings is New York City. Like it or not, the place that has grown most share in venture capital finance and innovation is New York City. And then it's Boston and LA and Seattle. And when you look at it, people talk about Miami and Austin all the time. I spend the winter in Miami. My colleague and co-author collaborator, Stephen Pedigo, runs the Urban Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. They're rounding error on the amount of venture capital finance innovation that occurs in the Bay Area, and they're less than half of the venture capital finance innovation that goes on in Chicago or Philadelphia. What's happened, though, is that the overall pool has risen, and that's a good thing. And this really bears emphasis. It's not so much that these smaller places have increased share or grown at the expense of Silicon Valley or New York. They've grown because the pool of venture capital financed innovation, the pool of technological industries has grown. So everybody's absolute level. So Cincinnati has a cluster, Cleveland has a cluster, Pittsburgh has a cluster. We can go down the list. Moreover, and I think what's important is, even if that innovation remains highly clustered, the ability for talent to plug into that innovation cluster is much more dispersed. So I call it clustering with dispersion. A big fancy way of saying you can still have stuff clustered in these tech hubs, but the technical talent that can plug into them from many more places. And so you can have an outpost wherever you want. You can do that kind of work. You can connect to companies from a wide variety of places in those hubs. So yeah, I think that we should always separate and not confuse where innovation is happening from where talent needs to be. They're related to some degree, but increasingly they're pulled apart. And remote work gives people a lot more options of where to live, even if they have to connect into a company in one of the big incumbent hubs. And hopefully, we don't have evidence of this yet. hopefully what happens as a result of this is that the hubs that are emerging in second and third tier cities can grow and grow and grow, and over time become more self-sustaining.
Well, and I'd like to, add into this conversation. If you, look at this historically over the last, let's say 40 or 50 years, universities have traditionally built these things called research parks, which were primarily research focused. And there really wasn't an emphasis on talent whatsoever, to Richard's point. And so, it's like, what's that next thing, be it artificial intelligence or whatever the new technology. In today's ever-changing economy, talent is the number one driver. I mean, love to do research, but if I don't have the people to actually conduct the research, there's really not much research to be done. So this evolution of innovation districts, from our perspective, really kind of does two things. One, it provides a place for companies from startups to Fortune 500 companies to innovate, to take a problem and solve it, whatever that problem may be. And that's really important because, innovation could occur anywhere, doesn't mean it should. So having a place where these organizations can come together to solve these problems is important. But I think there's even an equally as important factor to this as well. It provides a mechanism for these same companies to connect with these economic engines to say, over the next 2 to 3 years, this is the kind of talent I need. These are the kinds of degrees that are really important to me. And here are the numbers behind that as well. And I could use your help in helping us to build that pipeline to help support our organization. Because we're all in this digitally transformative time. And whether it's more computer scientists or companies just needing to upskill their existing workforce, we're all in this economy today where having these tight linkages, these tight connections become critically important.
So David, picking up on that, I'm curious on innovation districts more broadly. We've seen them grow over the last decade, 15 years. I myself did work on Boston Innovation District over a decade ago. And I'm just really curious how you see these districts continuing to evolve and what impact they can have on a region, particularly the one that you're sitting in.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I think they're critically important for every community, especially if you've got anchor institutions, be it community colleges, be it universities, be it healthcare centers. I think all that's really important. But Brooks, to your point, I mean, these innovation districts, what I call Innovation District 1.0, started out primarily focused on research. And whether you're looking at Kendall Square in Boston or Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh, a lot of this has been really focused on research. In talking to businesses today, the number one issue that they bring to the table is we need access to talent. We need access to people. So I see, if you will, the Innovation District 2.0 having a focus, continued focus on some level of research, but a bigger focus on how do you help us meet the talent needs that are critical to the success of our organization. And if you think about it, here in Cincinnati, we've got a number of Fortune 500 companies. We as a public institution have a responsibility to ensure that the businesses that are here today remain economically vibrant. The only way to do that is to sit down and have a conversation with them in terms of what are their needs. And based on that, can we as an institution be a convener to really help address those needs? At the same time, every one of these organizations are working on problems that matter. And, as I stated earlier, innovation can occur at anywhere. It doesn't mean it should. I like to describe, a little bit, if you think about an art studio, if we wanted to be an artist and be a creator, we wouldn't necessarily do that in our home. We wouldn't necessarily go out to YouTube and try to figure out how to do that. We would find an environment that had all the tools in place for me to actually create something. So if I was an artist, it might be the palettes, it might be the paint brushes, it might be the paint. If I like to mold clay, there'd be an environment to do that as well. What else would you find in these environments? You'd find everybody from beginners, apprentices, all the way to experts. But you'd also find in this environment a curator to really help curate this overall environment, to help that creativity. In a very similar way, because of the pace of change, businesses are being challenged on a lot of different fronts to innovate, to come up with creative solutions to problems that are ever increasing. What an innovation district really provides is an opportunity for these businesses to have an environment where the tools are there to help them work on problems that matter, but also have a curator to be able to bring these things together. And I think this collaboration amongst the organizations, which is something we've seen here, it's not about just connecting to the university, but organizations to be able to connect with one another in an environment that really facilitates that's going to be important. And so I think that's going to be, we're going to see this as being the next evolution of this. It's not just research focused, but really creating these environments where organizations can collaborate. And as importantly, really a nexus where these organizations can connect with the sources of talent to really help fuel what they're seeking to accomplish. And again, it's going to make the local economy stronger, but it's also going to provide an opportunity for other communities to look in on these models and figure out, how do we take elements of this? Back to Richard's earlier point, there's the amenity side that's critically important. There's the talent side. How do we take those models and help communities really accelerate their efforts as well? It's really important because, again, the pace of change is only accelerating. It's not slowing down. So communities trying to serendipitously or haphazardly figure this out is going to be a challenge. And I do think there are a lot of models that can be looked at, and pages from those playbooks can be applied to other communities to see what's important to them in terms of working to solve these problems.
Yeah, I like to give credit where credit's due. And on this one, I got to give credit to my old buddy, Bruce Katz. Bruce, at some point when he was at Brookings, and Bruce is just an incredibly interesting thinker, to be quite candid. Sort of said, we have all these different threads emerging in economic development, in subnational local economic development, and we can pull them together in a context of an innovation district. And I think, Bruce went around the country and really helped communities understand why they need to create them. Brooks, you even said you're involved in one in Boston. So I think innovation districts, as David said, bring together three or more key threads that have happened in the evolution of economic development over the past 3 decades. If you go back to what economic development was when I was in graduate school, it was big game hunting. It was get yourself a pile of incentives or bribes, stack it up as big as you can, and go try to hunt your big game. That's what economic development was, because the belief was that if you could lure a company and you had highway jobs, you'd solve all your problems. What happened, of course, is that we realized that that was a very inefficient way, that's still done, a very inefficient way to use public resources. Companies gamed the system, they took the money and ran. And over the course of the past few decades, 3 new themes emerged, which I think the Innovation District kind of pulls together. The first, credit Michael Porter, the idea that you would have a cluster, that you could build a cluster. You didn't have to go out and hunt the big game, but you could work hard and you could build up a cluster, and not just of technology firms, right? His examples were the Emilia-Romagna, his examples were the winemaking areas of Napa and Sonoma County, the office furniture cluster in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as well as high-tech Silicon Valley. The second theme that emerged was talent, and the idea, and I think I helped with this, I think Ed Glazer helped with this, emerging in the early 2000s, that just having a technology cluster wasn't enough. You needed to undergird that with a support structure, ecosystem of talent. And then somebody said, oh, anchor institutions, and I forget who said that, but somebody said anchor institutions matter. Universities and medical centers anchor these darn things. They're not highly footloose. They tend to be staying in place over long periods. Let's connect them up to the ecosystem. And so in the Midwest in particular, you had incredible efforts like Pennsylvania's Ben Franklin Partnership Program, Ohio Edison Program. You can go down, that were really, really important early advances in state and local efforts to stimulate technology and talent and support anchor institutions. And then finally, we're talked about amenities and quality of life, this idea that that place-based economic development matters. So you have technology, talent, amenities, and place-based economic development, and then innovation districts try to pull all of this together and say you can't do it as one-offs, as David said. You can't just do it, by the seat of your pants. You now have a framework where you can think about technology, talent, quality of place amenities, anchor institutions, and place-based economic development. And I think one of the things that our federal government hasn't gotten to, it's really been states and local governments that have understood the place-based nature of this. I mean, if anything, and I don't want to be too critical, the federal programs have made it harder have benefited the superstars and the big institutions. That made it a little bit harder to do place-based economic development. Hopefully that's changing, but it's really been this effort. And David said it very nicely. It's not like it's pure replication. When I go around, if I go to Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Detroit, Buffalo, Iowa City, Minneapolis, everyone's game plan is different. No one is doing the same thing, but they're working on the same menu of activities and mixing and matching that public-private, sets of menu items, foundation and philanthropic sets of menu items. But they're all doing it in a bespoke way that's tailored to the needs of their community. Hopefully over the next few years, we could get the federal government to be a more active supporter of this.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to have the federal government be a more active supporter. We're starting to see some of it. I would say with the EDA Build Back Better Regional Challenge, which we've been working with some partners on. And you all actually mentioned that in your Wall Street Journal column, and noted that 11 of the finalists are from the Midwest. I'm curious how you see that type of catalytic investment potentially create the equitable growth we need in the region and also enhance U.S. global competitiveness.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of different, pieces to this that become critically important. To Richard's point, a lot of this has been done at the local level with what I call brute force and awkwardness. I mean, just communities coming together to go make things happen. And unfortunately, there's only so many dollars that, can be infused to be able to make that happen. Here in Ohio, our economic development folks recognize that talent is the issue. And if we're going to accelerate this, there needs to be fuel to make that happen. So they made a commitment of 100 million here in Cincinnati, then 100 million in Columbus, and 100 million in Cleveland to really help us accelerate the number of STEM graduates to help increase the supply of talent that these organizations so desperately need. But there's only so much they can do. If you look at this at a federal level, what does the federal government do well? One, policy, a national policy and framework around this, but they also have capital that can be infused to really help accelerate those ecosystems. And they can really do this in two ways. One is we absolutely need to increase the supply of talent throughout our country. And we need to do that not just with new college grads, but we also need to help individuals, everyone from low income or underemployed, unemployed, to those that are employed, have the skills that are needed in today's digital economy. So that's a critical element where they can help really accelerate that. And by the way, there's accountability. I would tell you with the Jobs Ohio investment here, we're contractually on the hook to hit numbers, both in research and in STEM. So it's not like this money's just coming in as a grant and we're free to spend it. So there are mechanisms that, in fact, the federal government can hold communities accountable to these particular dollars. But the other key piece of this is in research. In order for us to remain competitively on a global scale, there has to be, investments through NIH, NSF, and others to really help us accelerate in key digital technologies that are going to be important, not just to today, but are going to be important in the future. And one of the things that we have to recognize in this creative class, talent economy, if you will, is that every organization, regardless of the industry they're in, is experiencing digital transformation. And it's easy to look at the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts who are already in the technology business and say, well, they're the only ones experiencing that. It's really a lot of their tools that are being used by everyday companies that exist in our society today to digitally transform, to help them really take advantage of these technologies. But in order to take advantage of these technologies, you need people who understand how to apply those technologies. And that's where this intersection of the worlds comes together. And this is really where the federal government can have a key role in helping us to reestablish our dominance, our oneness, if you will, in a lot of these key technologies and helping us decide what technologies we really need to focus on. Because this digital framework that we're all living in, we're just scratching the surface of what this new economy is going to look like.
For the life of me, Brooks and David, I never understood why the federal government doesn't get this. I really didn't. I guess when I was a little kid, John F. Kennedy was president, then he was assassinated, and we had the Great Society. And I always thought, wouldn't it be great to go to work for the federal government and help make America a better, stronger, more innovative place, the equivalent of putting a man on the moon. And, I don't know when it happened, but the federal government just seemed not to be concerned with these problems. And I just gave up. I'm being really honest. Like, there were times early in my career when I went to meet with people in the National Science Foundation, in the Department of Commerce, go to the Hill. And then I don't know when it was, sometime around the turn of the new millennium, it's just like, no, I just stopped going. I tuned it out. I'm not the only one. But there does seem to be hope on the horizon. And I think you nailed it, Brooks. Part of it is Build Back Better and EDA. And David was the one who attuned me to those 11 finalists. And what's interesting is, after we published that piece, I wrote another piece from City Lab at David's encouragement. Write more about this, Rich, about that and about how the federal government might be rediscovering place-based economic development. And my inbox was literally inundated from people from the US Department of Commerce, the EDA, and now the National Science Foundation saying, thank you, this is what we want to do. And then I realized something. A whole new generation of people had grown up reading our stuff. And although they cut their teeth at the local level, some of them, one fellow in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, another fellow in Maryland with Martin O'Malley, these younger people had ended up in positions of influence, in the federal government. Maybe they were involved in who knows why. But they not only were about innovation and technology policy and quote unquote industrial policy, they were about place-based economic development with an eye to how you develop places and how do you expand community wealth and community wealth building. I just think that's magnificent. And I think it's bigger than most of us think. I think Build Back Better is part of it, but I think it could be much bigger. And I do think there's bipartisan support. I think people like Ben Sasa, he will support this. The bill, right? What was the bill? You guys know the numbers. That passed in the Senate got a bunch of not complete bipartisan support, but a lot more bipartisan support than just about anything else. So look, I think this could be big. And what I'm hearing is two things. One, within NSF, it's not going to be business as usual. If you just want to be a better version of MIT or Carnegie Mellon, there's going to be grant programs for you. But if you want to compete for this stuff, it's got to be tied to cluster building, innovation districts, place-based economic development. And the other thing I'm hearing is that people are willing to take a flyer on whole new models. So, and I don't know if this will be the case, let's say no incumbent universities really want to change their stripes. If some local philanthropists, some local industrialists, and the federal government might take a flyer on creating whole new kinds of, maybe not whole new kinds of research universities, but whole new kinds of institutes, research centers, hubs, if you will. So I think we're at this real inflection point where this is likely to gain a little. Now, there's a lot of things pushing against it. But then if you take the international environment, right, what's happening with supply chains, with Russia into Ukraine, and the looming threat, at least in some people's minds, of China, you've got a climate in which this kind of thing could gain a lot more traction than at any other point in my adult life. So I'm cautious and cautiously optimistic, but I think for the first time in my adult life, there's a possibility to align the federal, the state, and the local around place-based economic development.
No, I mean, I've got to admit that to me, it's really exciting because I went into urban policy because I thought that's where you could get stuff done, was at cities. That's where things happened. And this is the first time that I've ever felt very much like what you're saying, Rich, because it does seem as though there's partnerships between the state, federal, and local for the first time. And I think the competitiveness piece is key. As you were saying, on the international front, the only way we're going to compete as a country is to recognize that it's in our regions where the economic strength lies in this country. And so
it's
we really got to
mention that. So the origins of that piece was, I was trying to write a memo to a group of companies saying, what happened in the 80s and 90s when I was cutting my teeth was you all organized around industrial competitiveness. And you got the Sloan Foundation and Mike Porter, and you got the Department of Commerce, but you led it. Hewlett-Packard and General Motors and General Electric and whatever. You led an effort to organize the country because Japan and Germany, in your minds, were eating our lunch in manufacturing around industrial policy and competitiveness policy. Now you've got to turn your attention to place-based policy. And the business people just kind of like, who cares? Yeah, right. That's not something we care about our own town. But what happened, as I was making that argument, the federal government, unbeknownst to me, on its own dynamic, was picking this up. So then I just took those basic ideas, and I think, Brooks, you said it, we have to shift as a country from competitiveness based on just technologies and industries to competitiveness based on and innovation based on places. And if we can do that, because that's, the places are what organizes technology, talent, anchor institutions, then I think we have, people talk about, I always think this is just silliness, the decline of American power, the decline of American empire. If I look at it, and I look at the assets of American universities, American innovation, American places, America's 380 plus metropolitan areas, I go to myself, I don't think America has ever been this, maybe a slight period after World War II, when America emerged victorious. I think you're looking at an even brighter American future than American past, if we can get past some of our own divides. And maybe place-based economic development helps us there too.
Well, and I think, if I can just add to this, I think we've got a unique opportunity, right? I mean, you typically go see a doctor when you're feeling well. And I think, the fact that we're protected by two great oceans, we've got a friendly neighbor to the north, and economically, a neighbor to the south, that, we're not feeling that. But if you think about even this Intel deal and just kind of break that down a little bit, what's driving that? There's a concern that chips go into everything.
Yep.
And we don't have a competitive advantage if in fact the very technologies that drive this aren't made here in the US. And so there's an opportunity because of concerns about what China might do with Taiwan and other things that may occur. This whole Russia situation is really, I believe, at a federal level, caused officials to hit a pause button and say, we really need to think about what competitiveness looks like. Now, a piece of this clearly is around manufacturing, and it's looking at things like chips. But by extension, if you start to think about this as people, and people being a competitive advantage, this now plays into also, what are the policies, what are the things that we need to do as a nation to really help accelerate that development here in this country as a competitive advantage of what we're doing here as compared to what other nations are doing. And I think we've got the right environment. I think to Richard's point, we've got the right environment today in a way that probably with events not occurring wouldn't have happened any other way. And I think there are a number of bills that are currently sitting in Congress today that have a significant opportunity to help change the game here, not just for communities, but for the nation as a whole. And I think the other piece of this, if you go back to, Bruce Katz, one of the things he talked about in his book, The New Localism, was that, it's kind of hard at a federal level to do the things that need to happen. And so therefore cities really got to take responsibility for their communities to make things happen. Well, I think we've got an opportunity at the federal level to really have policy and some infusion of dollars with accountability to make some things happen. At the same time, with the work that Richard's doing, the work that we're doing here in Cincinnati, again, I come back to, there are models that exist here in this country that other cities can learn from to really help accelerate their efforts. Not everything has to be custom built. There are templates that exist that really will help accelerate this effort overall, which again, not only makes us stronger as a city, we've seen here what the Intel situation has done for our state and candidly by extension is going to do for the Midwest. But I think this is an opportunity that other cities, other communities, these place-based models can take a look inside what's occurring here and really take elements to apply to their specific communities, again, to help them accelerate their efforts. Because the one thing we all have in common here is that time is our enemy. Things are moving so quickly that we have to accelerate our collective efforts.
One thing that David mentioned, and I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish on this, but it's worth thinking about, is talent attraction. If you look at where people around the world want to go, and that's from any country, Europe or China or Russia, it's the states in North America. And I say North America because I think we have an ally in Canada where I spend at least half my time. I think that, if I think about my two neighborhoods directly opposite me in Toronto, they're both Chinese, one from Taiwan, one from Hong Kong. You look at the Russian communities in and around New York, parts of New York City or Miami, they're huge and growing. So talented people still want to come to the United States. One of the things I found so interesting in the whole HQ2 competition is the Detroit proposal, which was joint with Windsor. This always stays in the back of my mind that, I gave a talk one time and they said, Dave Petraeus thinks the same thing. And I've never talked to General Petraeus, but this idea that if you could somehow unify North America, Canada, which is a big country that can take lots more people with great universities and a lot of space, and then a manufacturing periphery in Mexico, and that there is something in North America that's unique. And when I look at the biggest talent attracting machines on the planet, they're the United States and Canada. So yeah, I think that this is our weapon. In this competitiveness battle, our weapon is the ability to attract talent and then energize and mobilize these talents and this talent is highly localized ecosystems. And I'd add one more thing. It used to be that foreign talent was all massively concentrated on the coast. That is not true anymore. Now, in Canada, there is a really great dispersion of new Canadians, but in America, it's getting much better. So, when I get picked up at the airport by my Uber driver, it is almost exclusively an American immigrant and not from an obvious place. Somebody from the Middle East, somebody from Jordan, somebody from a province outside of Russia. And so I think this ability to attract global talent and motivate and mobilize that talent is our secret weapon. And it's one we got to double down on, and it can make a huge difference in our overall competitiveness and the rise of all kinds of places across this country.
Well, I totally agree with you, Richard. In fact, I think that's, if you go back to a statement you made earlier about our economic policies have traditionally been around, luring companies and luring them with incentives to be able to attract them. And then, of course, the view was people will come. I think there's a unique opportunity for us to look at economic policy, not only within our states, but across our nation and say, how do we attract people here and create incentives for the best and brightest to be a part of our ecosystem? I think you're absolutely spot on, but we haven't necessarily looked at the world that way. There's been from a guy who came from the software industry, even back in the 90s, I remember quotas on H-1Bs. And yes, we got a lot of the best and brightest, but they could only stay here for so long before they had to hit back to India, based on immigration requirements. I think there's a real opportunity at a federal level to take a look at policy relative to human capital, to the creative class, and determine, are there mechanisms, and there are mechanisms to really help attract, but as importantly, retain that talent here in North America.
So with that, I think we're just going to have to wrap it up. What has been a great conversation today. And it's left me incredibly optimistic, which is always nice when you have one of these policy conversations, because it feels like we have a good path forward. We really need to double down on place-based innovation and think about how the Midwest can be the hub that we need it to be as we go forward. So thank you both for joining me today. And with that, we'll wrap.
Thank you, Brooks.
Thanks, Brooks.